Hi, good evening, everyone. Hope,
Hello.
hope everyone had a
Hello.
good spring break. Sorry, I am
Yes.
trying to find the
Yeah.
chapter. All right, so for this one, I guess we decided we would break it into three parts since we didn't have a fourth partner to lead discussion. It looks like Michelle, you'll do the textbook, Diane, you'll do the article, and then I will do refugee, which is perfect because I am a refugee.
hmm
So I'll talk about my experiences once we get there.
That works. So you guys want to go with critical comprehension first?
Sure.
All right. Um, I thought that we could kind of just share some thoughts about this week. To me, what really stood out to me is the opportunity to teach kids about perspective. Like, for example, the locomotive. Like, I loved the idea because even as I was reading the book Locomotive, I was like, they're leaving out the voice of the Chinese immigrants. And then I didn't realize until further into reading this particular chapter that that was 90% of the population who was helping with creating the railroads. And so I just thought, because we hear about teaching kids the different voices, and I just thought that some of these were the best example of that. I really appreciated when it talked about how when children have opportunities to connect the past to the present, history becomes more relatable and relevant. And then it goes, and this is on page 182, and it also talks about how history tends to be oversimplified and told through the dominant narrative that emits the voices and stories of marginalized groups because it's usually told through textbooks. And I I know I mentioned this before, but I'm very, very excited because we're getting a curriculum next year called Arts and Letters. And so many of the books are going to be a part of that curriculum, like the fry bread, the locomotive. I'm not sure if Unspeakable was in there, but anyway, I just thought that I really liked this chapter because it really gave great ideas about how to be specific and teach kids about different perspectives. I've done it in the past, like at Thanksgiving time, I would usually or for point of view, teaching point of view, I would read the kids the book Encounter. Are you familiar with by Jane Yolen, the book Encounter? It's about Christopher Columbus when he meets the Taino people, and the little boy is very worried about these strangers, these white strangers, and um, so it gives that perspective of them. First of all, it gives a voice and a name to the people. It's not just the Native Americans. It's not just the Indians. It gives a name to the actual people that he first met, and then it kind of talks about their hesitation and fears. And then I used to have the kids read an actual article. I mean, I'm sorry, an actual journal entry by Christopher Columbus where he's describing these people. But that's as far as I took it. Whereas I like a lot of these questions in here that actually get the kids thinking about whose voice is missing, whose voice is heard, what's the difference. Anyway, so my question was, I guess how did, because I know like for you, Lynn, it's a little different being at the high school level. So how were some ideas about how you would use this
Well,
information?
I wanted to ask, did they change the curriculum? Because I grew up in the 80s and we learned about the majority of the Chinese, the Transcontinental Railroad was built mostly by the Chinese. We learned about San Francisco, and I grew up in 80s Mississippi. So,
Mm-hmm.
so it's a little shocking to me that they don't teach that because I remember
It
learning that in like either elementary and middle school. And mind you, I grew up near Biloxi. So, I mean, we're not like, culturally proficient in the area that I grew up. So that was shocking to me that like that wasn't a well-known fact.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with up to this year, our district really hasn't had a mandated curriculum. So teachers kind of created their own curriculums. And being a reading teacher, I really didn't like think about like I mean, I tried to pull in social studies
Hmm.
and science, but it wasn't to the point, I was using these books mostly to teach the reading standards.
Okay.
So I think that has a lot to do with it too.
So maybe the focus has been more on like the standards and not the context, the historical
Right.
context.
Because as
Okay.
a reading teacher, that was more, I'm teaching point of view. I'm using these books. I would pull in a lot of books. There's one called The Other Side, and it's about segregation, about these two little girls each living on the opposite side of the fence. So I would try to pull in these types of books, but it was more like to teach things like what's the theme of the story, what's the main idea.
Okay.
But I
Yeah.
like the way
And
that
I
these go further and deeper.
and I wonder if that's what we're doing a disservice to is I don't know what the standards were that my teachers taught me, but I do remember us talking about the Chinese immigrants coming over to finish the railroad. I remember them talking about San Francisco. Now, they didn't talk about how the Chinese men were not allowed to bring their wives over, right? We didn't talk about the Chinese
Hmm.
Exclusion Act, but we did say, I mean, they talked about that in the same way that we talked about slavery. And again,
Right.
I grew up in a small town called Long Beach it's near Biloxi, Mississippi. So,
Okay.
so I wonder if like we've shifted away from that because of this whole idea of we got to focus only on the standards and we focus on
Right.
certain standards and not like understanding
The
that
actual content.
yes, yeah.
Right. Like what are the historical stories that need to be told? Because I agree with you. Like I briefly remember learning about the Japanese internment camps when I was in school, but it wasn't like dived into very
Hmm.
deeply. So I think that again, I think that classes like this help us as educators to see there's ways to go in there a little deeper than just the subsurface. Let's cover the standards and move on.
But I think that's what we've been doing. We talk about let's just cover the standards and move on because we got so much
Right.
testing. My kids are talking about milestones and teachers are asking for snacks. And so we've like,
Right.
I don't know if you've taken that teacher
Yeah.
data class, but it's like test after test after test. And I'm like, is this helping my child? Like
No,
what, like, well, what
I'm
does this do
sorry.
that the teacher, I mean, that doesn't
It's
already
not.
know about my child that is going to convey to me?
I just feel
Um,
like,
Absolutely.
as a side note, the all the state testing is just more for, I don't know, like school scores and for the adults in the building, not necessarily for the students in the building, because it's it's a test that at the end of it, what are you going to do with the results? Well, they're moving on.
yeah, and
It's
I
not a
don't know.
formative at all, and then it becomes the summative that is
So,
like
so I
what it's not used for anything except for to give teachers evaluations and
the school rankings and
school
whatnot.
rankings and things like that. So it's to me it's kind of
so
sad.
I think we've lost ourselves in all of those since No Child Left Behind, those little data points, and
Yeah.
we've kind of lost because, like I said, when I was growing up, the teachers that taught me loved their subject. I mean, I remember there was
Yes.
one teacher in sixth grade who taught me, I didn't know anything about Argentina. She was talking about Eva Perón and she was talking about that song, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina.
Don't cry for me,
And
Argentina.
and I had never heard of those things. That's not something that I feel like would be taught today or even mentioned. Um,
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
here's a fun fact. I lived in Argentina for a couple of years.
okay.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Diane, I feel like
And
you've been everywhere.
I it's
I'm
yeah,
jealous.
it's
I want to
funny.
see your passport.
I know, right?
Well, yeah, that passport, it was a long time ago, y'all. Argentina was a long time ago.
Still, that
But
counts.
okay. But here's what's interesting about learning about Argentina and Eva Perón and all that stuff, a voice that they don't ever teach, that I did not know until I went to Argentina, was the fact that, well, there were a couple of things. she was not all that she was portrayed, but she also is very protected by them, and so they are very upset with the United States for coming out with a movie that portrays her that way. And I had no idea. It was really interesting.
Oh, I had no idea
Huh.
either.
Hmm. Yeah, no,
That's
they're not happy with
interesting.
it.
Interesting. Talk about, different perspective and
Yeah, but I
yeah.
would have never thought it.
And like I feel like that focus, we need to shift away from that. I am seeing a shift away from like this focus at the high school level, at least from like I want to say around when I first started teaching this hyper focus on getting kids to a 4-year college. And my kids who didn't want to go to a 4-year college always felt less than because they didn't, they
Mm,
wanted to be a plumber
sure.
or electrician and and I think we're finally realizing that we need to engage those kids who are not planning to go to a 4-year college, who are not planning to, and we need to help them. So, but going back to your question, Michelle, yes, at the high school level, especially since they're so old and they can handle it, we do teach those things. I don't know, like, when they talk about like Thanksgiving Day, I remember learning about Thanksgiving Day and like how they held hands in elementary school, but when I went to high school, that's when I started learning about the reality of things. And so when you were talking about the Christopher Columbus, we actually in American Lit read Christopher Columbus's journals.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we read the thing. So the kids will read the explorers narratives,
Okay.
and then one of the things I make them do is like this is gonna sound really terrible, but I make them make a dating profile for
I love
the for
that.
for these terrible men, the conquistadors and all of that. And the kids are like, Miss Van, they are such awful people. I don't know how to make them like good. And I said, well, you got to think of it from their perspective. What do they think that they're bad people or good people? And so that really helps them. And they literally they make like not a Tinder, but they make a dating profile for Christopher
Wow.
Columbus, like looking for a partner who wants power, is okay with slavery. Like so it really makes them think about like how these people feel about themselves.
Mhm.
Because I think, when you tell them to read something, they read it and they regurgitate like the summary. But when they start thinking it from like a a psychological standpoint, they begin seeing, like in his eyes, he thought he was just doing stuff for the king. He was just claiming land.
I do like that because I mean, I think that's important too, to part of the point of view, part of sharing with kids these things is that they weren't choosing to be bad people. I like the way that you kind of, this is what they thought was right. They weren't choosing to be bad. Now we understand that what they did to the indigenous people, how they went about things, that it was not fair, it was not right. But it's not like they were intentionally, I'm going to go out and harm people. It wasn't like that. So I like the way that you bring that aspect into it.
Yeah. I do find it interesting as far as like the whole Christopher Columbus thing, being taught in school all the time that Christopher Columbus discovered America, but yet when he got here, he had to fight people. So that didn't
Oh,
make it,
Yeah.
I'd never understood that growing up and no one ever adrassed it. You know what I
so
mean? Like, how did
is
he
that something
discover
we
it
should
when people are
address?
here?
Is that something we should address at the elementary level? Do you feel
Well, I
like?
don't know that we should address it at the elementary level, but at the same time, I don't know. Maybe there should be a book written from the other perspective, or
Hmm.
and have that shared because I think we do need to think about the people who this was their land. I mean, they end up teaching about the Trail of Tears and things like that early on.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean,
Yeah, they
it
do.
seemed to me like those would go hand in hand, but I think a lot of people would probably be very offended to have a teacher say, well, but did he? You know what I mean? Especially at a young age. So I don't know, but
Well,
that's one of those things I feel that's whitewashed in America.
yeah. Well, I think at
Yes.
the high school level, like the kids kind of we talk about like it's not that he discovered America, like we defined it, because they're I mean, I'm teaching 16, 17-year-olds
Right.
that he brought news of the new world to the old world. And that's his accomplishment. And so,
Okay.
when we read in the textbook, the person was talking about simplifying, simplifying.
Then
But I
that's the
think
problem.
I
They've simplified it so much that they've left that part out. And so,
so so I think I feel like children can handle that. Like
mhm,
Oh
learning
yeah.
that
I agree.
he not that he just found America, but that he bought news of this new continent to the old world. Um, but I don't know. I mean, like I said, I think it's all about wording
Yeah, I
and
agree.
I
Choosing
wonder how
words.
much of it is because that we feel like children can't handle harsh things when they're young, kind of like when we what Dr. Scullin talked about race.
Mhm,
And the
Yeah.
discussions we're not having because we worry or we unconsciously think that they
mhm,
can't handle it.
mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Because I think that, for example, if I really liked the book Locomotive, and I think that even if I'm using that to teach an ELA standard, I think that to take a few minutes and say, hey, who's not represented here, who's like different, like you can still get deeper with the kids, like what you're saying, Lynn.
Hmm.
I think they can handle it. I think even though we're so standards driven, I think that there's a way to kind of build that background knowledge with them through these types of text. For example, I had never, let me find the book because now I'm like I had never, for under the book Her Right Foot, talking about the Statue of Liberty, I never even realized that the Statue of Liberty is walking. So, I mean, you could be talking about, what's the main idea of this book, and then still bring in those thoughts about, she's shown on the move, because, fighting for freedom and all that. So I think there's a way to, that happy medium of dealing with what you're supposed to through the standards, but still bring in the more in-depth thoughts and exposure to different people that we're learning to do in this class. Because I know that the last 2 years there's been so many things that I've learned in my master's of reading program that I'm like, that just doesn't work. And
Hmm.
it's frustrating to me. For example, all the creative writing and all this kind of stuff that I've learned, and I'm like, but we're so data driven to get them to the milestones, and they have to write
That's
according
all
to the
we care
milestones.
about, the milestones.
Right. And so I guess we have to be creative as educators. And yes, our jobs rely on us being able to teach the standards, but again, to find a way that we can incorporate some of these deeper messages for kids to build their background and their deeper understanding of the world.
mhm.
Okay. And
That's just my thought.
I will say, like after I read some of these books, even I was curious. Like I didn't know I knew fry bread was a part of like, the Native American culture, but I didn't know it had started because of the rations. I read up on how to make fry bread and like I didn't know about the Tulsa massacre.
I didn't either.
So I read
Yeah.
up on it, 'cause like it was like I remember hearing about it, but it was not like you hear about Rosa Parks, you hear about MLK and all
Yes.
these, but I didn't know about the massacre. And one of the things, like, we talk about what we leave out, one of the things that they didn't talk about is that not everyone that went to Ellis Island got into the US. Like
Mhm.
people were
Right.
turned away and sent back to Europe. You were checked. And I only knew that through reading an adult book where there was
Mhm.
an immigrant family where their friends were turned away because they had bronchitis. I can't remember like not pneumonia, but something, and they were sent back because they were unfit. Um, and so for me, it's like we read for with the text, we read against the text,
Yes.
and you see both sides, which is not all immigrants historically have been welcome, um,
Right.
even from Europe.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah. What was that in our reading where it talked about very few comparing, oh, I know what it was. We won't go there yet, but in the book, in our book reading where it talked about very few immigrants, in his author's note at the end of the book, very few immigrants have actually made it through to America compared to other countries.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Well,
And I can
Absolutely.
talk about the immigration process if y'all want once we get to refugee too.
yeah,
So,
and
Yes.
I think that that's again going back to my time in Argentina. I mean, everybody wanted to. A lot of people aspire to come to the United States, but it's very, very expensive,
and
and
it's
most people
very
can't
hard.
afford it. And
Mhm.
anyways, but yeah, we can get to that later. But I think that's an interesting conversation of how welcoming we actually really are.
And
Right.
then I think for the alternative perspective, one of the movies, I don't know if y'all have ever seen Smoke Signals.
Mm-mm.
It's a it's an old movie from the 90s. It's about a Native American, a group of boys. It's really funny and it's really good, but it's called Smoke Signals. And I know one of our high school teachers at my old school used to show it to the kids. But it's just kind of it goes along with Sherman Alexie's The Diary of a Part-Time Indian. So I think he helped produce that. So I don't know if y'all know that book, and we've talked about it before. But it's about his experiences of growing up in the reservation and then like leaving to go to a private school and like all the stereotypes. I'm so sorry, my dog is beeping his toy. Um, decided
I
to
can hear.
decided to basically uh go to a all white school and like how the kids treat him, how his teacher treats him. So it was eye opening and then he made a movie. So something if if y'all have time, Smoke Signals. It's like it's sad but at the same time it's funny. It's kind of like that movie. Have you seen Life is Beautiful?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so that's about the Holocaust and it's a comedy, but I know, right?
I'm
I
like,
used to show it
whoa.
to my high school kids, but it's a good movie.
Okay.
It is a
Okay.
good movie. It is about a Jewish man who goes to, they you don't know, but basically Auschwitz. But it is a comedy. So it was made in the late 90s. So Smoke Signals and Life is Beautiful. It
The
won a
90s
lot of
were a crazy
awards.
time, man.
Uh,
When
yeah,
you
I
can
mean
make that
it.
into a comedy.
I just remember leaving because we had to watch it for in a college class. I just remember leaving the movie theater sobbing because it was so funny because you're laughing, but you know the ending's got to be bad because it's the Holocaust.
Right.
But
Right.
couple of you know, movies if y'all are interested in watching.
Excellent. Thank
Good
you
to
for sharing.
know. Thank you.
All right. Diane, you want to go next
I do.
on the
Yeah.
next one?
So the next one was that it was chapter 7, right?
Yes.
In the other I call it the other book. Anyway, and I thought it was really interesting because it talked about the difference between war and terrorism and really the
Yeah.
similarities. And I think that's one of the main things that I came away with. And I think it's because of just yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about it like that before, where they're basically the same thing. It's just one's justified because it's for a good cause.
Cause. Yeah.
And is it though? So anyways, I thought of a couple questions to help guide us. And I guess the first one is, do you ever think it's truly possible to have a just war, especially when it comes to fighting terrorism? And I thought that's an interesting thought. So I just want to know what you guys thought. Is it ever possible?
I, when I teach high school kids, I always tell them, even serial killers had somebody that loved them. You
Well,
know,
sure.
Mm.
I'm like, you can say that they're terrible people and they are, but nobody is 100% good and nobody is 100% bad. And you
Right.
cannot define people. So I think when you talk about war, you can't really say it's good or bad. Like, I think it depends on who talks about it. One of the things that they mentioned, and I made a note of it, is they talked about all these wars, right? And how terrible they are.
Yeah.
Um, um, it was on page 161. I don't have my reading glasses. But let me put them on. I underline it. It talked about the Vietnam War, and I'm a Vietnamese American refugee, the Gulf
Okay.
War, the war in Afghanistan, the war against terrorism. But they didn't really talk about the Korean War, and I thought that was interesting. Um, because, and here's the funny thing to me is when I was growing up, my dad and my family, all those South Vietnamese people that fled the US to the US, have always talked about the American um, being in Vietnam as a good thing. that they tried their best to defend the country against communism, and they did everything they could, and we are grateful even though we lost. And so,
Hmm.
but when I was growing up in the 90s as a teenager, I would have all these Vietnam War vets come up and ask me if I was Vietnamese, because I guess my face just reminded them of somebody in Vietnam, and I would say, "Yeah, yeah," and they would just dump their like Vietnam stories on me. And as
Oh,
a
bless.
teenager, I
Wow.
didn't know. I would just listen. And it was like they were very bitter about the war. They were like, we should never been there. It was a losing war and all this. So it was really interesting to see the different perspective coming from the Americans who fought in the war and the loss, and the Vietnamese civilians who were grateful that America was there. And so one of the things we talk about in my class, because we do talk about war, is would we have felt, especially like the things they carry, would we have felt the same about the Vietnam War had we won? The same way we feel
Right.
about the Korean War? Because there's a North and South Korea, but there's no North and
Mhm.
South Vietnam. Would we have felt the same way about the Vietnam War as the Korean War if we had won the war and there's a North and South Vietnam? And the kid said, absolutely not. We would not be that bitter.
I don't know. I don't think I think it would be different. I mean, think about that. Like, one thing that I've always been taught, I don't know where it first started, but in school is that, history's told by
The
the
victors.
the
The
victors
victors.
always. And so would the story be different if we had won? I believe it would be.
And so that's what we talk about. I mean, obviously there's no answer, but there's no rancor as much, I feel like.
Mhm.
When it comes to the Korean War, nobody talks about like how, and yeah, obviously there are different things at play, which is the draft and all of that too. Um,
Yeah.
but I mean, like I thought it was interesting. I mean, like I said, high school, it's easy for us to talk about these things because I mean, one of my boys, Henry, was trapped in Syria. He had been visiting family. He was stuck in Syria for 2 weeks because of, Israel. So he flew back to US 2 weeks late. So these are things that we talk about in class. And I feel like at the high school level, we do talk about war. We do talk about terrorism, justice, and freedom. And like the victors are telling the story.
Yeah, they are. It's funny, not funny, haha, but interesting that so in Doha over spring break, right? I meet a one of the basketball teammates who is his name is Igor and he's from Serbia, but he has no home to go back to. So he has, because of the war, he's now been pushed out into these countries. He can't see his family. It was just interesting that it coincided with the same time that we're talking about this, to hear his experiences of losing everything. He doesn't have anything. And so he's just hoping and praying. And he's a little old for a basketball player. So he's 35 and he doesn't know how long it's going to go on, but he knows that he has to keep getting contracts because where else is he going to go? And it was just
Wow.
really interesting to hear him tell his story. And so it's like, who's justifying that war? Because now it's personal. You know what I
Right.
mean? Sometimes it's easy as you just hear about it in the news, but you don't have a personal in on a war that's currently going on or that is recent where somebody is actually truly being affected by it.
Mhm.
And I don't know, it was just interesting to me because of the whole, what war is just, and somebody who wins this war or who's winning this war is telling the story.
Well, that reminds me, this really stood out to me on page 157. It said, what is justice to one group may not be for another.
Yeah.
Justice can only result from knowledge and understanding of all viewpoints. And I think, in relation to what you were asking about, can we justify war? In the section that you were talking about, Lynn, I found it very interesting where it talked about that we look at things like the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, all these preemptive wars, that we were fighting for democracy and oppression in the rest of the world. But then we have other places that lived under oppression, like South Africa,
Mhm.
Sudan, Somalia, the Congo, we didn't give them the help when they needed it? And is it because, the Western world was safeguarding its oil resources? So I think a lot of it has to do is what's the underlying motive for a war? Is it because we're really, I mean, if it's something like we're really fighting for democracy, we're really fighting for someone that's being oppressed, then I think that that is justified. But if it's, well, we're only going to get into this because we want to protect our natural resources or there's something in it for us, well, I don't think, how do you justify that,
Mhm.
So
I
that's my thought.
For the Vietnam War, I was taught in high school is the domino effect of communism. I honestly don't know. I mean, I don't know that the United States had some kind of vested investment in Vietnam at the time that they would have stepped in to, like gain. So
I
I,
think
I
that for
couldn't.
them at that time, I think it really was, because they didn't have like oil like we do in the Middle Eastern countries. But I think for them, it really was that the Cold War, let's fight communism. I really think I think it was a war to like fight oppression, to fight communism, keep that from spreading. So that's my thought on
Okay.
that.
I
But
mean, it's probably true. Most when I look back to the books that I teach, like Ellie Wiesel's Night, um, you know, we talk about the things they carry. I don't actually teach that book just because I don't like its depiction. Um, it's not an easy book to for kids to get into, but we do talk about these things in class. So I think it's just more easy at the high school level. I feel like to
yes,
be open with
yeah,
these kids and to
Yeah.
talk about those things than it is for little kids because
absolutely.
I mean, because I will say, like they talked about, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We did these terrible things. But one of the things that really bothered me was Japan at the time was the killed like 30,000 Chinese people in the rape of Nanking. They were marching down to Vietnam and killing the northern peasants. So one student actually told me she felt like the Japanese were kind of like the colonizers of Asia in the same way that England was the colonizer
Hmm,
of Europe. She was like, there's
interesting.
something about people on islands where they feel the need to spread out.
that
Um,
that was very
she told
in-depth
me
thought
that,
for
and I was
her.
like, you're probably right, but there were so many atrocities, and like one of the things that, and I understand when you're a kid, when you're reading these stories, it probably is helpful for you to see that perspective. But I also think we have to also balance with the fact that I mean, they killed babies. They raped grandmas and women, and wives, and
Yes.
young girls, and like 30,000. I mean, the rape in Nanking was terrible. They went up to North Vietnam and chopped off people's heads for existing. And even
Right.
though, like one of the things that we kind of, I know it sounds terrible, we joke about was in America. Like I don't see myself as Chinese or Japanese. I see myself as Vietnamese. But
Hmm.
she is Black American, but she's actually half white and half Black. And she said that just growing up in the South, she's realized that there in America there's four races. It's Chinese, Mexican, white, or Black. And I find that to
Hmm.
be very true. Um,
Yes.
and
Hmm.
so like I feel like that's we have this tendency to simplify things already,
Hmm.
just in societal. And so I think maybe if we bought more of these little books in at a younger age, that can kind of
Yes.
slowly erode and disappear over time.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
That's a really good point.
But we can't do it all by ourselves, for sure.
Mm-mm. No,
No.
no. Um, so the other kind of piggybacking off of the justifying war and stuff like that, and then you talk about freedom because we talked a little bit here about freedom and how it means something different to everybody, you know, and does the hope of freedom make war, does it justify it?
I guess like we have to ask the kids that. Like, do they feel like the war was like if the American Revolution had never happened, would we be in a better place?
Right. Who knows? And I mean, and I don't like to be political at all, but I feel in this instance, like if there were to be a war now, would there be people existing in this country who would justify it?
Yeah, I would say yes.
I I think so. Do you know what I'm saying? So I guess these are the things that I was thinking about as I'm reading, and I'm like, it's kind of hitting home because, we don't, you know, necessarily, well, we don't like either war or terrorism,
Hmm.
you know, but I guess it's all in the eye of the beholder, I guess,
Order.
the person who's
And
interpreting it.
I didn't like this piece as much, I think, because they talked about not simplifying things, but I felt like they did to simplify things
Yeah, they did.
in the reading. Like that was like their whole thing. I was like, "Oh, you did a survey. Oh, yeah, there were 22 diverse teachers. 20
Yeah.
your pool was 22 diverse teachers." I mean, we're not talking that's all you could like pull coal out from the population of teachers in the United States in your study? Like that really bothered me. And like they made it sound like it was a big study. And so like for me, I liked their textbook way better than this piece. I just felt
Agreed.
like they simplified it so much. I mean, like that Syrian student, I had a conversation with him and I asked him, is there going to ever be peace in that area? With the Palestinians and the Israelites. And he said that the issue with he said, Americans don't understand that, like in that area, people are very tribalistic. And I had heard that
Mm,
word before from my Ethiopian kid years and years ago, who he said, even though we have these boundaries, we're very tribalistic. Um, in our like in the country. And so he said that even though we don't have racism, we have tribalism where we have these tribes who think they're better than us or we think we're better than their tribes. And then that war in Ethiopia between that group happened. I was like, "Oh, so that's what he was talking about." So I thought that was interesting because I had never heard of that word before, because the I grew up in the United States. Racism, we talk about that a lot, but we don't talk about tribalism. And so when Henry talked about the tribalism, it made sense to me. So that was like,
that's really interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah. Um, because I kind of agree with you with that war versus terrorism. I mean, it's so much more complicated than that.
Right.
Um, somebody that goes and shoots up a school, no, that's pure evil. What Timothy McVeigh did in Oklahoma, killing all those innocent people at work or
Awful.
all those children in daycare, that's evil.
well, they said that they didn't label him as a terrorist, but I heard him be called a Christian terrorist when I was growing up. So I didn't know what that
Right.
article was talking about. Like, that's to me like, so anyway, I won't go on because I just think this chapter is simplified so much,
No,
um,
and I
of
agree
the
with you
terms.
I
because
agree.
those,
I
these
agree.
things are so complicated. So, because it kind of goes back to, if you're going to get into a war, well, what's the underlying? Is it to protect people or is it to protect your resources? There's so much
Mhm.
involved in war and
And
what
how do,
people call terrorism.
And how do
Yeah.
you talk to your to young kids about it? At high school, it's easy. I got a kid from Ukraine. He talks
Mhm.
about it. I got a kid from, I mean, like we talk about these things and the nuances. I don't know how I would talk to a 5 or a 8 or 9-year-old about it.
Yeah,
I think I
very
shared
different.
about my little friend at school. Her name is Gardenia, the one whose family fled from Pakistan, Palestine. I think it's Palestine. So, and it's just interesting to hear her perspective. And she was really little. I mean, obviously she's in second grade, so it's just
Wow.
kind of what her family has talked about and things like that. But in that instance, it's easier to bring it up because you have a child whose family has lived through it. So in that instance, in that class, it would be pretty easy to have a conversation. But you're right, generally speaking, I can't think of many reasons that you would bring that up in first grade.
Right.
And is it
Absolutely.
psychologically appropriate other than kind of what we said, whitewash, I mean, like
Right.
not
And could they
whitewashing it, but like
understand?
making it like a kumbaya moment.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I would want to have more training as a counselor at that young age because I think like
Yeah.
Lynn, I think your kids are at a maturity level and everything like that to be able to handle it. But I'd want more like before I start bringing up some of this stuff, I'd want some more training on on how to be respectful but also careful with young emotions and young minds. So I don't know. Yeah.
Because
Mhm.
I don't think, I mean, we don't want to make our children fearful, right? So when we talk about the
Right.
war and we talk about 9/11, I don't know how deeply you can dive into that with young kids. I know
Right.
with my kids, I can.
Sure, at
And
home
we
you
do.
that's a different story. I think in the classroom it just brings on a whole different challenge.
Yes. Yes.
All right. So any more questions, Diane?
No, I think we covered it. We
Okay.
simplified it.
So I'm so glad I was the one to lead this part of the book, Refugee. So I'll tell you a little bit about my backstory. My father, back in the late 70s, left Vietnam on a boat. He said that in
Oh, wow.
1975, when Saigon fell, when the United States withdrew and Saigon fell, he did not leave. He said at the time he had a decent job. The country you know, in war, it wasn't like terrible, terrible. So he decided to stay. He wishes he hadn't done that because he said that back then in 1975, the United States rescued every refugee that was in international waters. So he said basically, if you got on a boat, you got in the water, you were rescued, and it was much easier to leave the country. Uh, so my story is very similar to like Isabel's story with Cuba and the government not allowing you. And so in 19, I think 77 or 78 before I was born, he actually ended up leaving on a boat with my brother who was like 7 or 8 at the time. My mom was supposed to join them with my older second brother, but the ferry broke down because you can't just leave, right? You have to have paperwork, and there are soldiers all over the place. So the ferry broke down, so she didn't make it to their rendezvous point. So he left without my mom and my brother. So they ended up landing in Malaysia. Malaysia was not accepting immigrants, refugees from Vietnam, so they sent my dad back. So you
Oh,
remember how Isabel's father went to jail? So that was
yeah.
my father. So he actually ended up going to jail for a year. And so I was like, "Well, what did you do?"
Wow.
And my brother went to jail. So we always said, he's the youngest convict in our family because he went to jail
So
when
they
he was
put
like
this
7 or 8.
7-year-old in
Yes.
jail?
Yes. And so they
Wow.
just helped build a like jail. My dad said it was all like hard labor. And so my aunt came. They released my brother, I think, after 6 months. So he was in the single digits, and then my dad a year later. And my dad, while he was in jail, met another man in jail who was like, "I'm gonna do a second attempt. Like I can't stay in this country anymore. It's so oppressive." And my dad said, hunger is not an issue in this country, but he's like, but when you watch your children starve and ask for food, you kind of just like you can't. You have to do something. So the second trip, he networked with that guy, and they were able to secretly build a boat. And so my parents said that they're the oldest of both of them are oldest of 7 children. Each of them got to choose 2 siblings to go with them. And I was like, well, why
Wow.
didn't you bring everyone? He said, number one, we didn't have enough money because everyone has to pay money to help build the boat. He said, number two, if I bought everyone, he said, you have to think we didn't know we were going to make it. 75% of the people who left after 1975 died at sea or were killed by pirates. And that was another thing. Their first boat trip was attacked by pirates. So
Wow.
before they landed in in Malaysia. So he said that they took all the jewelry, they raped women, they took their
Mm.
food supply. So he said, like knowing those dangers, he said if I had taken your grandparents and my whole generation, us, that would have been 3 generations of family wiped out. So he only took two, and my mom took two. And so my mom basically said that they were out at sea for a week, and then a big storm came through, and they had no idea where they were, and then they saw twinkling lights in the middle of the night. And so they started headed towards it. I was a baby at the time, so I have no recollection of this at all. But it was Taiwan. And Taiwan was accepting refugees. So we actually ended up at a refugee camp. We lived there for a year, and then my family, my dad, he's actually educated. So he knew French. So he was corresponding with a lady who was interested in being a sponsor. And so she backed out though. And like that totally changed our lives because if she had not backed out, we'd be probably in France. But they found an American sponsor. And so that's how we were
Wow.
able to come over. Because when you come over, it's not just about coming over. You have to like have somebody to help you, get a house, get a car, get, situated. And so that person helped us. And then from that, once my dad became like a U.S. citizen, immediately they started the paperwork to sponsor the rest of their family over. And like it's like what Diane said, it takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of like just a lot of time, and the process is not easy. So the majority of my family has come over. Like my cousin came over when she was 19 years old and back in 2007. And I asked her, I was like, do you miss Vietnam? And she said to me, she said, Lynn, there's a saying in Vietnam. I'm like, what's that? And she said, the saying is, even a telephone pole wants to come to the US. So I
Oh,
was like,
oh
I
my
was, I
goodness.
was like, okay, well, I'm not going to ask any more questions. But yeah, so that's our story. So I what I liked about
Wow.
this was how the author tied these three stories about like these three refugees together and how because they gave there's a poem I give because someone gave to me
Mhm.
um that I taught this year and I felt like that was the story. The that when it boils down to it, we're all humans. If we can just shed those you know biases, those things, how Mahmoud at the end like sees Ruth and sees that she's Jewish, but she's helping him. I think if we could do that in the perfect world, we could have a much better world. But in reality, I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Oh,
Um,
it's sad
No.
though, because it would be nice if it did, you know?
yeah, but
First of
like
all, thank you for sharing your background because that even brings a deeper point of view to it than even what was in this book. Like I would never have thought about pirates. Or, I mean, of course, it had the example of the storms and it had
hmm
the example of being in a boat that's falling apart, but and being out in the middle of nowhere and trying to find somewhere to head. But yeah, your example with your family, that's pretty poignant as far as there's
it
so
sounded
much more to it.
yeah, it sounded like Isabel's story a lot. I mean, the one thing that my mom said was a lot of people knew that our boat was being built and they went onto the boat when we left and they didn't pay, but they couldn't do anything about it because the communists were doing patrols. And so they didn't
Oh,
so she's like when we got on, the boat was only built for like 67 people and she said 108 got on.
oh
For the
wow.
villagers. And so she was like the food and like it was really terrible. So when, they were turned away from the Bahamas, that made me think of my own father who's turned away from, Malaysia, who was
Mhm.
not accepting
Mm,
refugees. So it was interesting to see. I also feel like, one of the things that he mentions, the Mahmoud mentions a lot is like being invisible and how like if you
Mhm.
are invisible, then people don't see you, you can't get picked on.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like what my father said, don't draw attention to yourself, you know.
yes.
So I thought that was, and he's in his, he, he, he's in his own country. I'm in a country that's, for my dad, a foreign country, but for me is home, and he's telling me that. So I thought that was interesting.
I
And then,
thought that I appreciated that theme too, where he comes to realize if you're invisible, though, you're invisible to the people who have the power to help you as well. But that was a really powerful theme about because you even saw it with um, the others too, like uh, Yosef. where there are moments where he wants to be invisible, and even Isabel, that she wants to be invisible. Um, so again, it just kind of makes it more understanding of why it's so important to give everyone a voice. And I've been trying to teach that to this group of fifth graders I'm working with for my project. And I think that they become so centered on just being assimilated into mainstream American culture that they don't recognize that it's okay to have a voice, because even just trying to explain to them, like, I want you to share your voice. What is your culture? What is your family background? Where is your family from? And I want you to find a book that kind of you feel represents your voice. And I had like one boy, well, I like football. Can I just pick a book about football? And it's been very difficult, like getting the kids to kind of come out of that. What is your voice? And I don't even think that they comprehend that. And so, because like one girl wanted to pick a book about a dinosaur because she was small. And so I've kind of had to reach in and kind of do a lot more talking about your voices is what makes you different. Where are your family members from? Where do you still have family members that live outside of the United States? And they've kind of slowly caught on to that. But I don't know, that theme that was in the book about make yourself invisible, blend in. It's like I can really kind of understand why that becomes a necessary tool for them and in the book. But it does, I
Have
don't
you
know,
been
kind of
able to
wipes out their
find,
voice.
I mean, have you been able to find maybe some of these examples of literature to help with that?
Yeah, so what I did um was it was in the last I found there was another. So as they were struggling to kind of find their voice, I did that other follow up. I did a follow up thing about the name. It was in our last discussion, but it was racial bias through naming practices. But I did the reading on the book. It wasn't this one. I did the naming jar, and I talked about, and then that kind of started helping the kids click a little bit, because they then all of a sudden they're like opening up. And then one boy, whose name is Shoe, he goes, I hate that. Kids will think they're funny and they'll call me shoes, like the shoes on your feet. And that's not who I am. And then another girl picked a book about that's not my name, because she's like, yeah, they always say my name wrong. And I'm always trying to tell them that's not how you say my name. And so it was kind of like when I did this lesson in here on their name, and we created this little book,
Hmm.
and I had little questions. I took all these little questions that were in the lesson and I printed them in the little book, and it talked about, what's special about your book, I mean, name, who gave you your name, um, and like the little boy from Japan, he was like, my name means sky. And he drew a picture of a sky, and he goes, so I think that sometimes, again, I go back to they don't even understand what their voice is supposed to look like until I started
But
going
you,
in deeper, and I found something that they connected to, and they were like, oh yeah, that I get that. So
I think that's a widespread problem, to be honest with you, with small, well, all children,
absolutely.
but especially the younger children. We were talking about that today as we were on our way to Macon to a literacy conference, and just how adults aren't talking to children anymore. So they're
because we're
not,
focused
Mm-hmm.
on the standards.
well, and I mean, even at the home. So like, we just came off of spring break, and like the kindergartners will not stop talking. And it's because we're convinced that they just had very little interaction throughout
Do
the
you
week.
think that has to do with technology? That less
Absolutely, I think it
conversations
does.
happening because it's easier to give a kid an iPad?
Yep. I
I think
really
it's
do
part of that,
think
and I
that
also
that is
think
that way.
and I think it's also part where some parents, because every school in our district is a Title I school. So you've
Mhm.
also got parents who are working 2, 3 jobs
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
And
Absolutely.
you've got bigger
That's an issue
brothers
as
and
well.
sisters that are watching kids when they come home from school, feeding them dinner.
Yep.
So I think that plays a role in it too.
So
It
Michelle,
really,
I
it
mean,
really does. So there are just multiple factors, but I found it interesting even back when I taught pre-K that, and that was years ago, that no one has heard nursery rhymes. Like things like that
Right.
have just kind
Yeah.
of dwindled out. And so I don't think anybody's from an early age even saying to their own children, well, how do you feel about that? And validating like opinions and finding your voice and what do I say and how can I don't know. It's just it's really interesting to me.
Well, I think it
Yes.
sounds like we're trying to do our part, right? In bringing up these hard
Yeah.
topics. You at the elementary school level, it sounds like you just have to scaffold a lot more than I do.
Mhm.
But you're sending these kids more prepared in high school. And as a first generation American, I will say, like, when you're a kid, you don't want to be different. So
Mm-mm.
that
Yeah.
pushback is not you, Michelle. That's like natural human psychology. Like, I didn't, my name isn't Lynn, but that's
Right.
what I went by because it's just easier. I just didn't want to be different. And I think a lot of my immigrant children, because I teach ESOL, are the same way. They want you to call them by Jenna or Emma or Abby, even though their name is Xiao Xiao or Lin or
Hmm.
Miyuing, like, because they don't want to be different. And so
Different. They don't want
sometimes
to be
I'll
different.
forget and I'll call them by their not, especially the Vietnamese kids, but they are
Yeah.
okay with it because they know I'm Vietnamese. But I think, like they just want to be so hard to be acclimated. That changes when they get older. And then there's this need,
Okay.
especially within the second gen Americans. I
Yeah.
feel like there's a strong push for them to reconnect to their roots.
And
Um,
that's good. Yeah, because speaking of that, it was so funny because I was talking to them about how special their brains are because they know more than, one language. And I was trying to like pump them up about, their differences being a good thing. And one of the boys was like, I don't really speak Spanish anymore. And he goes, I don't speak Spanish. I was like, and I'm sitting there thinking, you're in ESOL somewhere along the way, you spoke Spanish because you,
but he
you
hasn't
have
tested
not
out.
you haven't been tested out yet.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh, please, don't lose, your second language because I was like, that's so important. And, if you lose it, that's going to be, harder for you to get it back one day if you want it and blah, blah, blah. And then it was so funny because their ESOL teacher who was in the room, she's African American, and she's like, preach, Miss Salepi, because that's what I'm telling these kids all the time. It was
But as
so
long as you're
funny.
telling them, and they may not want to hear it. I feel like they probably do hear. All right, because of time, I'm gonna finish up with one last question. Do you think that Joseph Isabel Mahmoud would define freedom, justice, war, and terrorism the same way? Um, each of those characters, and then would our students define it the same way?
That's a really
So,
good question. I think that like Isabel, her biggest thing was her family she wanted her family to be together. She knew her dad would be taken away. Even though they didn't have a lot of food and stuff, that was almost like a secondary concern for them. Whereas for um Joseph and Mahmoud, sorry, it was a life or death situation for them. I mean, it wasn't that it wasn't a life and death situation for Isabel too, but it was literally, Mahmoud's home got blown up. For Yosef, his family, his dad's being arrested and taken away, and they're coming for them. And so again, it kind of goes back to that quote I quoted about justice is different for each person depending upon their viewpoint. I guess that would be the answer, yes and no. They're all
so
fearing
we
for
have
their
to.
lives, but the what got them to that point was very different.
I agree. And I think too that each one of them had a certain need within their life, right? That they were looking for. So like it could have been safety or it could have been um dignity for Joseph. You know what I'm saying? Like
Mhm.
it I
Yeah.
think those types of things would have meant freedom to those characters, maybe. And so in that sense, it might be a little bit different.
Yeah. If I were a middle school teacher, I would definitely teach this book because I like the portrayal of like Yosef, when he gets caught by that Nazi German youth, he thinks he's going to be turned in and this this kid shows him grace and just tells him don't do it again. And then Ruthie helping Mahmoud. And so like I think, when we talk about building empathy and we talk about like making people not like so Nikki Giovanni wrote this poem called I don't remember what it's called, but it's about a person killing a harmless spider, allowables, because they were f afraid of the spider. But it was like
Hmm.
a harmless spider. And the last line is like, I don't think I should be allowed to kill something just because I fear it. Um,
Hmm.
and so I think like, when we talk about literature being a vehicle, I do think that this book would be a good vehicle for kids to kind of like understand that we are all victims of war, of
Yes.
society, of politics, but there is a goodness in people that shine,
Mhm.
and you just have to like be that light for
Hmm.
others.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so I mean, we're not here to solve the problems, but I do think like this book was to me so powerful. I really enjoyed it out of all the books that we read. Um,
Okay, I don't know about you guys, but I could not bounce between the three stories. So I had to read, like, I would flip through and find all of Yosef and then all of Isabel. And then because I was like, no, you can't stop it right there. So I had to do that. But I really appreciated the twist that, for example, Isabel's grandfather was the policeman that
mhm.
talked to Yosef. And then, of course, Mahmoud is Yosef's sister, because then they drop it. It's like, who does the mom pick, Yosef or
That's
Ruthie? And I'm like,
gut-wrenching.
I mean,
but then that gets finished up when you find out. And but that was very, I don't know, it was very touching at the end where Mahmoud's talking about how Yosef made a sacrifice so that his sister could be there to help him and his
yeah.
family. And so it kind of goes along with what you're saying, Lynn. If only we could look beyond our fears, our stereotypes, our biases, and see each other as human beings instead of the racism, the tribalism.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, but I again, like you said, and I agree, all we can do is kind of put those thoughts into kids'
To
minds
the
through
minus.
literature and hope that it makes the world a little better,
And
as
Diane, do you feel like, do you like, I know we feel like as teachers we have to teach it. You said you just feel like parents aren't teaching as much.
Right. I just don't think that there's a lot of talking about deep subjects going on at home,
mm-mm,
Okay.
and how how are how are they supposed to be reflective or
When
empathetic?
when they're first teachers, their parents aren't doing it.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like you know, how are you taught empathy? Like if you don't
right.
have these stories that reach that part of you that has that empathy, I don't I think that this would be a really good book to teach in like the I would say fifth grade and up. Um
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a high school. I listed on the paper, like, so I read these books that I don't know if y'all enjoy reading as much. I love reading. So, like,
Same
before
here.
Shogun was made into an FX show, that was my favorite book growing up. Like, I read,
that's a good
Great.
it's
book.
a tome. It's like 1,000 page. It's
Yes.
so big they had to put it in 2 volumes. But I read it in like elementary. That's how much I love reading elementary, middle, and high school. It's still my favorite book. But Homegoing by Ya Gyasi. Um, and then Pachinko, it's about Korea. The Mountain Sings, this is about Vietnam and the history of Vietnam. And it talks about the Japanese people coming down and killing the Vietnamese. And then Night. So I thought like if y'all ever want to read, you can do that if you do a book club at the school to teach empathy. Because we like a couple of years ago we had a book club for teachers to talk about our biases. And so we read a book, we did a book club among the teachers. And then Eyes That Kiss the Corner is an elementary school book. It won a lot of awards, but it's about like
Okay.
basically Asian eyes. So Eyes That Kiss the Corner is a good one.
Yes.
If you
Oh,
want
I
to
know
do
which one
that.
you're talking about. And the other ones you mentioned, I think a number of them are listed in that chapter 7 that we read. So yeah, good points. Those are, I think that, I mean, I would just enjoy reading it for myself. So too.
Yeah, President Obama read Pachinko and recommended it. I mean, I learned so much about Korean history. So so that was
Interesting.
interesting. Okay.
Cool.
Well, anything we want to talk about, wrap up, or are we good? Do you feel like I think we came away with the idea that parents are doing less, so maybe we need to have to step a little more. The
Right.
government needs to stop focusing on standards and letting teachers have a lot more freedom and, teaching the things that we're passionate about.
I
Um,
agree, but I sat in a training today where they said we need to teach the standards and not so much the resource, and I'm all, "Arr."
I
So
mean,
yeah,
there's been a lot of criticism because Gwinnett County, our ELA person, tried to ban us from teaching novels and making us use excerpts from our textbook, the Hoffman Mifflin, and there
oh
was such
no,
backlash. And we're like,
No,
we're
no,
supposed to
yeah.
teach children to love books, but yet you are telling us we can't teach
using
novels in the
them.
classroom. We have to teach excerpts from our textbook,
Wow.
which is
That's
a
crazy.
Yeah,
so,
it
and
is
then,
crazy because research shows that using authentic text is the way to go for both teaching reading and
Yes.
writing.
but
Yep.
So,
that's 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 where we're kind of headed, and like it's all political,
wow.
and so I think in our world we can only do so much.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. I
Okay.
agree.
All righty. Thank you, ladies, for
Thanks y'all
joining
so
me. I
much.
know
You.
it was hard because it's a Tuesday and we just came back from spring break. So,
Mm, I know.
I've
all right.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you
Yes, I
so
have
much,
too.
Diane,
Oh,
Michelle.
Thank you,
absolutely. Thanks, you
ladies.
guys.
Have a great evening, okay?
You
You
too.
too. Bye.
Bye.